Well, welcome back to the next session. What we're going to do in this session is review our full resolution subframes using the DJV video previewer. All right. Now in the last session I loaded it up, and it's in RAM, and I'm going to be able to now play it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit play, and I'm going to keep quiet. Kind of hard to believe, isn't it? But anyway, and we're just going to watch this video, and then we can go back and analyze it. Now this is 1800 frames, all right, at 1920 by 1080, and let's see what it looks like. Here we go. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now, there's some things that I need to do better, but that's pretty good. Now, that's at 30 frames per second. All right, and 30 frames per second is let's go up to the animation maker window. Now, this 30 frames per second, all right, is based upon, this is my big walk forward. This is my first big walk forward at 300 subframes, and then I did a walk forward and a look down. That's it. That's also at 300 subframes. This is all in my documentation now. I'm just kind of reciting it from memory. All right, and then, all right, we did another walk forward and looked down a little bit more, and then we moved into our right banking turn, in which case I set that for each of the right banking turn animation events are each at 100 subframes. Now, based upon these subframe settings per keyframe, at 30 frames per second, the speed that we have in our DJV is actually not too bad, but it's a bit slow. And I was saying in one session, probably 4 or 5 sessions back, that what I intend to do at some point is when I do a final rendering of this animation sequence, I was going to go back and double each of these to 600. All right. And that will give me twice as many subframes that will run in my video presentation at 60 frames per second, which would then give me an equivalent speed of what we saw here in DJV. All right, let's get that back to 300 so we don't mess anything up. Now, what I'm going to do is this DJV has the ability to run your animation at a wide variety of frame rates. It can run it at 60 frames per second as well. And I'm going to do that for you, but I want you to understand that if you take a video sequence that is designed for 30 frames per second and you run it at 60 frames per second, it's not truly 60 frames per second. And you basically would take your 30 frames per second run it twice as fast so that the animation is going to be half of the length, half of the time. And we don't want to do that. I don't want to shorten. I don't want to compact my frames into my 30 frames per second subframes into 60. I don't want to do that. But what I do want to do is I want to get a sense for the speed using DJV, all right, to kind of give me a sense for whether or not 60 frames per second is actually a good animation rate. So that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to set this to 60 frames per second. Not that I want to run the whole animation in half the time, but so that I could see the animation speed, all right, through the scene, and so I can kind of gauge whether or not that's a speed through the scene that I want. All right, so let's go ahead and punch this at 60 frames per second. I'm going to get this all the way back to the start so that we can see it. I'm going to shut up here and we can watch this thing play at 60 frames per second. All right, that was 60 frames per second. And the whole animation was half the length. But what I was interested in was the speed of the camera movement through the scene. And I think that's pretty good. I think 60 frames per second is what I want. All right. Ultimately, that's the speed through the animation through the scene that I want. Okay, so that's good. I can experiment with other frames per second too. I mean, if I did a 30, if I had subframes that were intended for 30 frames, and I went into my video editor and said, I want that to be longer. And let's say I knocked it down to 16. All right, let's take a brief view of what 16 frames per second look like with a 30 frames per second subframe design. All right, I'll start back at the beginning here. Let's just play. I'm not going to play the whole thing. You won't survive it. Here we go. All right, that's enough. Now, what's important to remember here is certainly the speed through the scene was chopped in half, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was right down in here, where you had this jittering going on. All right, the software, the DJ software, and your video editor is simply not capable of blending those frames together to give you a nice smooth transition from one subframe to the next, and so you have this jittering. Let's play it real quick so that you can see that again. Here we go. 16 frames per second from the beginning. Now watch down here. Watch down there. These lines right here. Watch them jitter. You don't want to put that kind of stuff out. That would get your viewers to click off your animation in short order. Now let's just do one other thing here, and then we'll close out this session. Now watch down in here. Now remember now the jittering. Okay, that's at 16 frames per second. Now let's go to 30 frames per second. All right, I'll watch down here. You'll see an improvement. All right, see how much smoother that was? at the native subframe frames per second rate. Now let's just pop this up to 60. There we go. And start from the beginning. Beginning. Here we go. Watch this area down here. All right. So this is illustrating that the more frames per second you have in your animation, the better. Go for 60. You do not need to go for 100, 240. Wow. Let's try it. Why not? Let's try it. Get to the beginning. Watch down in here. There we go. 240 frames per second. Too fast. Too fast. But you could. You could. Now for you to render your animation for 240 frames per second, you're probably talking, by the time you're done, if you wanted a 3-minute, I'm guessing, if you wanted a 3-minute animation at 240 frames per second, you're probably going to be rendering 20,000 frames and probably take you days or weeks. Unfortunately, what will happen is most of the venues up online that you put your animation on will nail you right back to 60. They'll throw a whole bunch of frames away and you're right back to 60. Now YouTube will publish your Mandelbulb animations at 60 frames per second if that's the rate that you make it in. They won't dumb it down to 30 unless you do something to tell it to do. So YouTube will do 60 frames per second. I don't think they're going to do 120 and 240. You don't need to go there anyway. 60 frames per second will look good. Take my word for it. You want to do your animations all the way from making the keyframes and the subframes all the way out to your presentation at 60 frames per second. Forget 30. Forget 30. Forget anything less than 30. Go for 60. All right, we'll pick this up in the next session. I'll see you there.